Good afternoon, everyone. And for the folks outside, and for the folks listening at home, wherever that might be. It's good to be with you again. If you take a look at your program, you're not going to see me on the program because this represents creativity and nimbleness on the fly. Harriet Tregoning and I were sitting next to each other and said, we've had lots of different conversations. Why don't we, over the next 25 or so minutes, do some initial opening remarks that Harriet will give in a moment, and then I'm going to fire off some questions. Our hope is within the next 10 to 15 minutes, we'll save maybe 10 minutes or so for some questions from folks on the ground. But I want to introduce Harriet Tregoning. I introduced her in the morning before she actually even had a chance to be here. She serves as our Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Community Planning and Development. And for those of you who know Harriet and have watched her career, know that she has seen these issues from so many different perspectives. And in a moment, Harriet, I'm hoping we'll have a conversation about how you look at the issues in preparation for Habitat 3 from all the various roles you've had and different angle points that you've actually had. But without further ado, I know you wanted to open us up with some quick reflections, and then we'll get into our own conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Solon. I'm really thrilled to be here, and the discussion has been so lively that we didn't want to have a dry keynote presentation when really the magic of this day has been the dialogue all around the room. And I think that's actually maybe one of the points that I could start out with, that one of the hallmarks of this convening is about learning from the city. That's been one of the hallmarks of the Obama administration. I mean, everyone in the room would say that we are nowhere near where we want to be, not in any neighborhood, not in any city, not in the nation as a whole, and there might be some stormy times ahead. In fact, we might have even bigger challenges that we're facing, and we certainly can't just do the things we've always done for the last 40 years in the way we've always done them and expect to get a better result. So that's why these dialogues are important, but it's also important that we try new things, that we experiment. And I think that has really been one of the hallmarks of the Obama administration. We all live in a time of tremendous change. I mean, it was a century ago that only 2 out of 10 people lived in urban areas. Most of this country was rural, and a lot of the systems that we set up, including our Congress, I think really reflect an agrarian society, not the very urban society that we have today. But we recognize the importance of urbanization in both the global and the domestic context. The majority of the U.S. population has lived in cities since the middle of the 20th century, and today, more than 80% of folks live in urban areas. That trend is only going to continue with about 90% of our population growth just in the last decade occurring within cities and within metro areas. They're central to our life, right? Since the 2010 census in particular, we've really seen a lot of return to the cities. Not every city neighborhood. Chicago's a great example where it's been uneven. Some neighborhoods have really gained in population, and others more on the edge of the city have lost. But across the country, a lot of cities have seen a 5-decades-long decline in population, a decline in investment really begin to turn around. That in and of itself presents its own challenges. I think many of our cities hope to turn around population growth and investment, but in no way planned for that success. And so one of the ways in which the Obama administration has really focused on helping communities manage change is to invest in planning for the first time in decades. And we heard a little bit about it throughout the morning, about the planning both at the community level, but also I think very importantly at the regional level. And we're going to, I think, talk a little bit more about that. I won't spend a lot of time, but I will say that Solon and I work for a guy, Julian Castro, who was a former mayor. Right? I love working for mayors. He's my 4th mayor that I've worked for. But mayors have a different perspective, I think, on things. They're used to taking a chance. They know what it's like on the ground. And the Secretary Castro came into HUD and said, this is not the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This has to be the Department of Opportunity. that our mission is to bring economic mobility to the people that we serve. Someone made the point earlier on a panel that it's one thing to treat the symptoms of a problem, right? To try to solve the impacts. It's another thing to try to say, what are the reasons that things are the way they are, and how do we more fundamentally change those things? And I think Solon and I will talk a little bit more about affirmatively furthering fair housing and the data that we're using to really highlight some of the extreme disparities that exist in so many of our communities and how we can begin to tackle it and address it. Maybe for the first time, really, ever in this country. So it's very exciting to be part of that effort, and I think it's one of the kinds of lessons that I think the U.S. Could and should share with the rest of the world. We have a lot of things to tell people about what not to do, but I think we now also have a few things to tell them about what we can be doing. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Solon.
So, Harriet, as I mentioned, and again, for lots of folks who know you and have had a chance to follow the innovations that you've been a part of, you've had a chance to see these issues play out from every perspective, local, state, and now federal. You've also had a chance, as a participant in COP21 in Paris, to see the central importance of cities for things as Derek was mentioning, that again are huge for climate change and resilience, but the importance of neighborhoods and cities really beginning to grapple with these challenges. As we think about Habitat 3, we are gathered here because we're in as someone said earlier, we're in a moment now where we both can look back at what we've accomplished and not accomplished over the last 20 years and look ahead over the next 20 years. What would be your sense, Harriet, of what the U.S. can really offer the world as we look at Habitat 3? Where have we been our best? And where is it that as you've traveled about, you've said, we actually, with sense of humility, we have a lot to learn from other places that have actually made much more progress?
I think that one of the really key turning points that has been kind of part of this administration, I have to say, 20 years ago, right? Habitats, these big international meetings don't happen very often, and many people spend a lot of time on very difficult negotiations, and you ask yourself in your city and in your neighborhood, what does that matter to me, right? And I think what is different about how this is being approached now is that, and this has been true throughout the Obama administration, that we need the critiques of the users of our services. We need the creativity of local governments. We need people who can move more quickly and be more innovative than the federal government can do. And maybe we'll take those lessons learned, and there are dozens of examples of when we've done that, and to change how the federal government does business. But we think the action is at the local level, and instead of just running a program, I think we increasingly across the federal government want to know what are your local needs, how can we help you align, not just the HUD money, but the programs of the federal government to get to these goals that we have: economic mobility, greater opportunity, greater access for communities, real change in communities. And so that was absolutely what happened at COP21. The Compact of Mayors really changed the conversation, and they were all over those negotiations, basically saying we got this in cities. Transportation and housing, energy efficiency, everything we would do to invest in those things only makes our cities stronger and more competitive, only makes our low-income residents have to pay less on utility bills and less on transportation. This is stuff we want to do anyway. We got this. And I think that's a lot more of the spirit that's pervading, what's going into this habitat conversation this time. And I think it's amazing. I think it's wonderful. We heard about homelessness, right? How long have we said that's just a chronic problem that we can't do anything about? It's so complicated. How do we figure it out? And yet, through the mayor's challenge to end veterans' homelessness, hundreds of places across the country figured it out, helped us figure out at the federal level how to align what it is we're doing to meet the needs of local governments to be able, and state governments to be able to actually succeed in changing what we thought was a chronic insolvable problem. And I think that that's really just the beginning. This partnership, and I call it a partnership, as opposed to a grantee relationship or a funding relationship or a regulatory relationship, I think is almost an infinite source of positive change in how we do business and how we get better outcomes in communities. So I think that's a lot of what we could share.
The other way?
And what we have to learn, there's a lot we have to learn, from other places. And I'll talk about something else that we do well that other places maybe don't do so well, and you do it really well here in Chicago, and that's partner with philanthropy. Let's be honest, government isn't good at everything. You might say government isn't good at a lot of things. One of the things we're really not good at is we're not that great at community engagement. We're really not great or even trusted in some communities, right? At reaching out and inviting people to be part of the conversation. We need other people to do that. And where it's really worked wonderfully in a lot of cases is where philanthropy has been involved to support that. And I think that philanthropy is kind of a uniquely US phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
It exists in other places, but we support it with our tax code. We have a history of robber barons in this country that used a lot of their wealth, and it happens today, to create philanthropic enterprise. It's a different thing. And it has been helpful in all kinds of partnerships all across the country, but in Chicago in particular. In terms of what we can learn from other countries, I mean, other countries have a much better social safety net than we have. In other countries, whatever your income, you can have a good life. You can live well. You can be safe, right? I mean, that isn't how it is in a lot of communities here. There are lots of things we could learn about that. I think in other places, the investments do a much better job of serving everyone in the community. We essentially, in the mid-20th century, privatized our transportation here. In the US, we built big highways and said, okay, get a car, you'll be fine. And we talked about, how hard that is. It's the second biggest household expense, and if you live far away from work, it can be the number one household expense. Other countries have done a much, much better job in investing in a much more egalitarian, much better network of access to employment and to services and other things. And I could go on, but those are some of the things we could learn lessons from, absolutely.
Harriet, there's been a lot of conversation since the top of the morning, even through the last panel and with questions from audience members as well, about equity issues, inclusion issues, segregation. And as someone mentioned earlier today, we've got to get better about talking about the disparities that exist in the country, with income inequality increasingly thought of as a global challenge, and that it's hit the campaign circuit in a particular type of way. Why do you think we're not making nearly the kind of progress on that issue here in the United States that we need to make?
I think one big issue is the history of racism that we have in our country.
That's right.
I mean, that is right. And I think it's made it very difficult to have an honest conversation about race. And I think that has held us back. We use other words, we talk about other things, but in some cases that is the issue. We've also done a lot of things through policy, through law. I mean, if I showed you a map of Baltimore today and the patterns of poverty and segregation, it looks exactly like a map I could have shown you in 1932, right? Generations of families locked in to low opportunity neighborhoods without the ability to really thrive. So I think we have to be honest about those things and confront those things. And I think the approach that we're taking to a 1964 law, the Fair Housing Act, is a very different approach. And most of the progress we've made on fair housing has been exclusively through enforcement. This is a different approach. Let's show people the data. Let's talk about what the impacts are on communities, on whole regions. Let's have a big coalition, because there's nobody who wakes up in the morning and says, how can I make sure that certain neighborhoods don't get any opportunity? There's nobody that does that. But conversely, it's also not been anyone's job to make sure that all the things, all the investments we're making, all the systems that we have are changing that outcome, that we are letting, we're letting it be possible that whatever your income, you can live anywhere in your community. You can do what other people do, which is what's a good neighborhood, where are the good schools, where are the good transportation choices, and be able to live in that neighborhood and give yourself and your family those opportunities. So that's, I think, someone in the last panel mentioned some Raj Chetty research. We had a program at HUD called Moving to Opportunity.
You know it well in Chicago.
That's a couple decades old, and some of the initial research on it was frankly disappointing. They looked at what happened for outcomes for adults, and there wasn't a ton of change. But the research has continued. It's gone on, and now we have data that shows what's happened to the children who got a chance to move to a different neighborhood. And particularly for young children who moved before the age of 13, unbelievable differences in their life outcomes. 31% higher lifetime earnings, a similar number for college matriculation. I mean, almost every kind of number you'd want to look at is better, right? And so that's why we should feel urgent, right? That there shouldn't, we can't afford to let another generation, right, be deprived of those opportunities. So I think that certainly is what it's making us urgent at HUD. It's making Antonio urgent, here in the Chicago region. It's making a lot of us here in the room, feel very urgent. I don't know if you saw Secretary Fox's, he's the transportation secretary, former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. I mean, he's been tweeting and putting out reports, having a very honest conversation about the role that highway construction has played in the fate of mostly black urban neighborhoods, right? That those highways destroyed those neighborhoods, it divided neighborhoods, and that this is the first transportation secretary ever, to be candid about this. He talked about riding his bike in his neighborhood in Charlotte and then being stopped at the highway and not knowing why, like he couldn't get to where he wanted to go. And now that he's transportation secretary, he knows why. And he wants to do something about it. He's appalled by it and wants to, but it's the first time, I think a sitting transportation secretary has ever acknowledged this. So I think we need more honest conversation. We need urgency, and we need to use all the learning and all the support and all the pulling together that we can get to change things. And part of it is learning from others at Habitat, but also sharing what we're doing, what is and isn't working with the rest of the world.
Last question I have, and then I'm going to open up for, as folks are digesting and hopefully keeping themselves relatively awake. You can't sleep on Harriet Tregoning. Last question, and I was struck, and this is literally in real time, having listened to the last panel on suburbanization of poverty and really thinking about the linkage between housing and transportation, right? You mentioned a moment ago, Harriet, two largest expenditures for most households. And it's very interesting in the history of the country as people have moved out, that while housing presumably got cheaper for them, maybe, these other expenses got picked up that have largely made it unworkable potentially for them. You've done a lot of work on the importance of looking at those expenditures together, and wanted to give you an opportunity to comment on why that's really important to look at housing and transportation and jobs, these things together.
Well, I mean, I think we have a history in our country, not just at the federal level, but at every level, defining a problem extremely narrowly and then seemingly solving the problem, within one agency, and in fact, maybe creating lots of other problems. Our problems are now too big and too complex for us to do it that way anymore. And frankly, we don't have the money, because we end up wasting a lot of money when we do it that way. So what's been so encouraging is the investment that we've made in regional planning and regional collaboration. Earlier in the administration, we probably invested in 74 or so large regional planning efforts. A lot of those places also looked at fair housing and equity analysis, so they were some of the first efforts to hold up disparities in communities. And in so many places, just the maps and the wide range of stakeholders that were really involved were galvanizing, extremely galvanizing in those places. And so now, you have a region-wide dialogue in dozens of places around the country with lots of stakeholders, business stakeholders, institutional stakeholders, community organizations, neighborhood groups at the table talking about how do we get it to a different outcome. Because you know this, the job market is regional, the housing market is regional. There's no way any one jurisdiction can solve any of these problems. Transportation, housing affordability, and mobility, right? Where can you live? Where are the housing opportunities? How do we make sure that whatever your income, you can live in a great neighborhood? You can't solve those problems at the scale of a single jurisdiction. So, HUD at 25 years ago, I think 1989 was the end of its last investment in any kind of regional planning. So to bring this back again, right at a moment when people are really ready to talk about solving problems at that scale I think has been terrific. Another area where it's been important is in disaster recovery, disaster issues, right? We're seeing more and more effects of climate change, more frequent and severe weather, a lot more rainfall here and in other places. And who is most vulnerable to that extreme weather? The low and moderate income households that a lot of us here serve. So what are we doing, about that? And how do we pull together to make sure that we have regional solutions? Because in a lot of cases, when you're talking about preventing disasters, something that one jurisdiction does, think about a river. Building a flood wall there actually makes flooding worse in the adjacent communities. So how do we solve these problems regionally?
I want to send a cue to the audience for folks who have mics to position yourselves for questions that might come. We'll take about 5 to 7 minutes. The last question I have for you, Harriet, is in thinking about Habitat 3 in Quito, Ecuador in 2016, what's your sense of what you are most hopeful that we will get a chance to talk about this year? You mentioned before that these kind of high-level conversations that stay up in the clouds, it's really important for them to be grounded locally. But are there some particular kind of thoughts that you would say, my hope coming out of October 2016 at Habitat 3, and particular for the next 20 years, is that we will stay focused on what?
This inequality issue. That is the thing that we have to focus on, and it's an issue here, but it's an issue globally. One of the things the recession did was really accelerate the kind of economic restructuring that had already begun to happen. I'll give you some grim statistics. In the Great Recession, we lost about 8 million jobs. The average wage of the jobs that were lost was $25 an hour. By the end of 2013, those 8 million jobs had returned to the economy, but at $11 an hour. Okay, so that is what's happening, and that's why the demands for what all of us in this room do are only going to get greater. The hope is localities, states, you're hearing minimum wage bills being considered all across the country, but municipalities can also make different decisions. Locally, you can make different decisions. You can partner with the businesses and industries that you have. It wasn't maybe the last panel, but the panel before that. We have to be in this together with some very high-level things that we're trying to accomplish. Economic mobility and the end of segregation and racism, right? Let's say that's what we want to get out of this. That if everybody in the region is on board with that conversation, on board with those goals, then you can ask everybody, you can ask every business, you can ask every university, what are you doing to help us meet this objective, right? We are trying to do this because our whole region is going to be better off if everybody is fully engaged in the economic, civic, cultural life of this region. And how do we make that happen? So I think that in some ways it sounds strange to talk about sustainable development goals and these lofty goals, but if you have agreement in your region about what it is you're trying to achieve, and everybody is on board with it, then it's a lot easier to have the specific conversation about actions that every organization can take. We heard from our last panelist, is it Noni, that we're passionate about this. Otherwise, we wouldn't be spending an entire day, here to have this conversation. We know what we're doing, but not everyone is engaged in this conversation. We have to get them engaged because the prize is a big prize. It's an epic prize, and that's what I think we should focus on for the next, for the foreseeable future until we get to where we need to be.
Epic prize. Nice moment. Question from audience. We have a question right up front. We'll probably be able to take one or two questions. Yes.
My name is Aida Giesciolo, Northwestern University College of Medicine. I'm interested in housing disparity, but I'm also interested in health disparity. Mm-hmm. I haven't heard any discussion that really tell us where we are in terms of integrating housing with health. So I wanted to know, in your Office of Community Planning and Development, have you been already considering a strategic directions in terms of integrating that sector that seems to be out of the discussion here?
Well, I fear that I probably left out a lot of things that I could have talked about, but health is incredibly important to HUD, and the environmental determinants of health is a big topic of discussion in our agency, and certainly clean, safe, and affordable housing is one of those very key elements to stabilizing families and individuals. So I think we heard a discussion about when you're homeless, how very difficult it is to do anything to maintain your health. But it's also true that these issues of access and quality neighborhoods, that those are also incredible determinants of what people do every day, what kind of exercise they get, what kind of access to food do they have, whether they feel safe, being out of doors. I mean, all of those things matter incredibly, and that's why HUD focuses a lot on communities, that scale of communities, not just on the scale of individual households and housing. But yeah, very important issue.
I see a question in the back, but let me give another quick response. We've had some very useful conversations with organizations like Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, if you've seen their Culture of Health initiative. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, they released an update on their county health data, and they made a strategic decision to incorporate segregation data for a largely health professional audience, because for them, the pathway toward greater health means we have to address the social determinants of health issues. So it's absolutely the right question. It's absolutely the right kind of context to be in, and I'll have a further conversation with you. We have one last question in the back.
Thank you. I'm Frank Avalon from Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. I want to agree with everything that Harriet has said, but I maybe want to frame shift the perspective just a little bit. For the better part of my life, I've been hearing about environmental insanity and social inequality and economic injustice, and everything from the effects of our interstate transportation system based on racism in the 50s and 60s. None of these things are particularly revelatory. Those of you who are near my age have heard these things over and over and over and over. And yet, we've become more divided. I guess what I want to say is that I want us to be a little bit careful about the rhetoric of self-sufficiency and the rhetoric of opportunity, because it places the focus on the individual. We need systemic change. There's only so far that we can go without changing the fundamental basis of the system and the profit motive that gets us into these problems over and over and over again, where all of us just play catch up to put Band-Aid after Band-Aid after Band-Aid. There's no question that our country is turning into an oligarchy, and what we need is more democracy. Where are the organized tenant unions in this audience? Where are the grassroots community groups? I want to give a pitch that more fervent democracy with the policy underpinnings cannot be left out of this equation. Everything that I've heard at this conference today, all good, I'm supportive. I do this work myself day after day after day, 60 hours a week for 34 years, fine. But to ignore the bigger policy question keeps us in the position of doing nothing but putting Band-Aids on things. I will give a quick example. When it comes to affordable housing, the grassroots movement across the United States that there's a groundswell of in the academic community, amongst tenant organizations, community groups, and the nonprofit advocacy community. When you hear the mantra, housing is a human right, not a commodity, you can't leave out the not a commodity part. What does that mean? What are the ramifications? Well, some of the ramifications are profound if we're willing to do them. It means rent control. It means affordable set-asides that aren't stupid and meaningless that you can buy your way out of. It means just cause to evict people from their families. Read the book Evicted, Paul Desmond. He shows that eviction is not a symptom of poverty, it causes poverty. So there is a set of 6 or 7 policy initiatives that can be done at the local level, the state level, and to a lesser extent the federal level, in addition to fair housing, which isn't a particularly good tool when it comes to gentrification or combating displacement. And so we need to take these bigger policy initiatives seriously if we're going to have a democratic society moving into an era to combat the chaos that climate change and capitalism is throwing us into.
Thank you for your comment. I just want to make sure it was a comment, but was it a question? Was there a question? Just to make sure.
There's no question.
Okay.
Asked for other approaches.
Okay, got it. All right. You have a last statement or a question? Go ahead, question. And then this will wrap us up.
Good afternoon. My name is Shashak Levi. I'm a former resident and local advisory council leader from Robert Taylor Homes. My family moved in 1962. I love to say we moved in during the good days, but we also were there during the last of the, I'll be rather respectful with the other S that I'd like to use for the last days. In our planning sessions, there was discussions about how there was supposed to be economic opportunities created for the residents. There was supposed to have been resident-owned businesses. There was supposed to have been resident training. A lot of these things got through by the wayside. In principle, let me show you an example at Robert Taylor. When they demolished all of Robert Taylor's high-rises, they allowed the land to lay flat for 5 years. Now, if it had not have been for some troubling things that caused myself and the young man Tyrone Galtney, who spoke earlier, to put in a lawsuit in 2004 where we actually forced the reality of the improper spending, the political hogging up of funding, the developers that were running rampant with all of the funding, but yet in the end, you got housing on State Street, but from the day that they tore down the buildings, there is not one new business right across the street. Right. There's not one new school, there's not one new store, there's not a hardware, there's nothing new other than the fact you have this housing that's on this side. But everything across the street, nothing has changed. We talked for 15 years straight about how come housing in HUD will not force the developers to do what was promised in our plan to help us create these things. Okay, so after all of that has been done, we're in the 3rd quarter, or pretty much the last phase of redevelopment for Legend South. Now we have a great portion of the land that's left open because the housing bubble bust. So therefore, the home ownership that was supposed to have been That didn't work. That didn't ever come into existence. So now you have the affordable and the rental, and they're debating about as to whether they want to kill the rental and just go all affordable, because under that, you can basically put a lot more people out of the way. Simply because right now, if you're not going to be able to pay your rent, your light, your gas, that pretty much means you're going to be removed. Now, as a position that was created under the Century Advisory Council for myself, I became the Economic Development Coordinator / fundraiser. Seeing that there were no stores being built, there were no businesses being created for the residents, I proposed a plan to Chicago Housing Authority and sent an additional copy to HUD, stating that I would like, as a resident leader, to create, and using the HUD guidelines, to create resident-owned businesses. My goal was to create 80 public housing resident-owned businesses in 4 sections of the city of Chicago. The Bronzeville, 35th to 55th, which is State Street, the Cabrini Green area, where there's almost no public housing businesses, period. The Argyll Garden, where businesses are just non-existent for the residents there, and then the former LeClaire area, which is, of course, on Cicero, just short of Midway Airport. So we're in the areas where much of the economic is now coming to. But in terms of things that are in need for the residents, that's not what's being created.
Right.
So therefore, I'm asking people that work at HUD, if I have a plan to help create these businesses for these residents. Residents have took up the entrepreneurship training. So we have done what we needed to do.
Right.
Now when we're in need of land, the developers are putting all type of different things in place to block the residents from being able to get access to the land. Then you have the bankers who are siding with the developers, along with the city administrators, to now again, once again,
and you want,
now remove all of the funding out of the hands of the residents.
You want a reaction to that?
I want a reaction. I want some help. I'd like some assistance.
I
I'd
hear
like
you.
some phone numbers. And I'd like, for more than anything else, I'd like to know for
you
a
might,
fact
you might,
that when
you
I
might
leave
get a bunch
here
of
today,
yeah.
I can actually
Fair
go
enough.
back to talk on behalf to our residents and be able to say, I got the assistance that we're going to need.
There have been a number of, thank you, sir. There have been a number of both stories and testimonials and questions, and maybe Jim and Antonio. I don't know whether we have anyone from CHA in the audience. Okay, but I'm not going to ask you to respond, but I think it might be helpful in a break for there to be a conversation, because there obviously have been numbers of comments and questions about CHA and long history of promises made, promises not being delivered. Harriet, I know you're going to have to head out, but a last reaction to comments and things that you've heard.
Well, I will say, I'm looking at Antonio, and we've got folks here also from the HUD regional office where all of HUD programs are kind of together. I don't have any responsibility overseeing public housing, but the issues you're talking about and the ambition that you have, I think is part of a conversation we'd like to be in. So that we can definitely promise you that we'll talk about this and see what opportunities there are. And the head of our public and Indian housing is a really wonderful woman who I'm sure will also be interested in hearing what might be possible. So I guess I would just end by saying that you have a whole afternoon of very exciting dialogue, I think, to continue. And I'll just join several others that have expressed their thanks to the great participation, a fabulous turnout in the room, and really a high-quality set of panels and conversations. Thank you so much for letting Solon and I be a part of it.
Thank you.